Thanks very much. I'm reassured by the fact that I was always told that the way to ensure you do a good talk relies on two things. One is following somebody doing another great talk, so I've got that covered, and the other is making sure you really need the toilet, so you get a sense of urgency. And I've got that one covered as well with all the coffee I've been drinking. So, it's great. It's both terrifying and great to have followed on from Joe and Mark's talks there, because they've simultaneously set the bar very high, but also laid some of the groundwork for what I want to be talking about, and I am hoping that any heads that remained unblown by Mark's talk will be thoroughly destroyed by what I'm going to be talking about, which is focusing in on blockchain technology and why I think it can fundamentally transform the nature of charity and the ways in which people are able to support charitable organizations. So what I want to just say quickly and by way of introduction is where I come from. So I work for the Charities Aid Foundation, where I run Giving Thought, which is our in-house think tank, where I focus on issues around philanthropy, charitable giving, the work of charities, both now and in the future. And blockchain is kind of one of the things that I have ended up focusing on amongst a whole range of other things. So this is very much blockchain technology from a philanthropy perspective, not philanthropy from a blockchain perspective. I'm not a developer, and I don't have the sort of technical expertise that Mark, for instance, would have. That being said, I've ended up working on this stuff for about 3 years now, which is quite a long time in the context of blockchain technology, and I've put out 3 reports on the subject, so one specifically around cryptocurrency and giving to charity, one around philanthropy and the blockchain, and then most recently one around blockchain and civil society governance. And what I want to do today in this talk is try and weave a sort of golden thread through these 3 reports and try and pull out what I think are some of the key opportunities and challenges that this technology presents for the work of charities. And I should apologise that the one downside of using Prezi is if anybody starts feeling seasick, that is actually a thing that can happen, so hopefully nobody will. Right. So the obvious starting point is this question: what is the blockchain? If you Google the term or start reading any articles about it, what you will almost inevitably see is words like it being a distributed, decentralised public ledger. You'll probably see something about Bitcoin. Not because Bitcoin is the same as the blockchain, which is a very important point to note, but it's by far the best known use case so far. But essentially what the blockchain is a record of transactions and ownership within a system that has a number of interesting features that make it different to kind of existing ways of doing that stuff that we're going to come on to in a minute. I think the next perfectly valid question is, okay, that's great, why should I care about that? A new type of ledger, that doesn't seem very interesting to me, particularly if it's just linked to Bitcoin. I don't have any Bitcoins. I don't really care about that. But I think the key point is that actually keeping records, and trusted records particularly, is absolutely at the heart of a lot of concepts that underpin the way society works at the moment. So all the way from back in the Middle Ages with the introduction of double-entry bookkeeping and the birth of accountancy, to the modern world where we rely on all sorts of different agencies and lists and registers of information to tell us who we are, what we own, what we're allowed to do. The idea of trustworthy ledgers is totally ubiquitous. And this puts a huge onus on the notion of trusted third parties to set up those registers, to see who's on them, and to maintain them. Now, the problem is, trust is a commodity that's increasingly in short supply. So trust in institutions around the world, certainly over the last 50 years, almost across the board, has eroded. You can see there, trust in US government, that's a pretty clear trend, I would have said. We haven't done much better in the UK, and charities, those of us who work in the charity sector are aware that we're currently in something of a crisis around the notion of public trust in charities, because there's been a lot of controversy recently about things like fundraising practices and the way that charities operate. So given that, one of the most interesting things about the blockchain, I think, and why it is getting a lot of people excited, is that it offers a way of overcoming that challenge. It offers a way of maintaining trust within a system without the need for third parties. I think one way of looking at it is it's as important as double-entry bookkeeping, but it's without a bookkeeper, or perhaps not without a bookkeeper, but with millions of bookkeepers, because everybody in the system is a bookkeeper. And as I've said, this revolution in ledger technology will obviously have a massive impact in the financial sector because there's a lot of ledgers that are very important in that sector, and that's where a lot of the focus is at the moment. But the applications are far, far wider than that, and that's what I'm going to be coming on to talk about in a second. A quick pit stop. I suppose it's fair enough to ask, okay, I've got a very vague idea of what it might be. How does it work? I mean, that is a topic for an entire lecture series, which I'm not going to go into now, and I'm happy to talk to people about it more later. But essentially what it is you've got a system, and you've got people in it who own things and transact with each other. And what you do is you take a snapshot of the system at a given moment in time. You do some clever cryptographic calculations on it, where everybody in the system kind of competes to see who gets the answer to it. That comes up with something called a hash. That is then added to that overall picture of the system to create a block. Now, the reason I mention the hash bit, even though that's technical, is that gives you one of the most fundamental things about the blockchain and why it's particularly interesting. You can have this distributed system, but because of the way the hash function works, every block is dependent on the one that preceded it and has an influence on the one after it. So it's almost impossible to alter blocks without also having to alter all of the ones that follow it. And over time, obviously, that becomes more and more difficult. So it's a highly secure system. Now, that succession of blocks forms a chain, the blockchain. Or, as I've said here, actually, I prefer to think of it as more like a tower, because that gives you a sense of the dependence of blocks on those that came before them. The good news, though, is I don't think you need to know any of that at all to really understand what it means for charities. What I think we need to focus in on is what some of the key features of blockchain systems are, and then I'll go on to kind of relate those to what I think are the key opportunities and challenges for charities. So the first one is the idea of transparency and openness. Do some swooping. So these ledgers are public. That's what's different about them. They're not owned by a third party who holds onto the data and uses it for its own end. As it currently stands with the blockchain, say, underpinning Bitcoin, anyone can download the whole of it and look at it and sift through it. I'll come on to just talk about this idea of radical transparency more in a minute, but another feature that is fascinating about these systems is that the assets recorded on them are unique in a way that, say, cash isn't. They're non-fungible, so you can't swap one unit for another one of equal value, because you'd be able to tell that you'd made that swap. So you can trace those units all the way through a system at any point. So the second one, which goes back to what Mark was talking about in terms of that broad sense of getting away from broadcast towards network, is the idea of disintermediation, decentralization, distribution. What's fascinating here, I think, is the idea that for the first time, because you don't have such a reliance on third parties to maintain these records, suddenly you could get rid of huge swathes of the service industry, so banks, lawyers, government agencies, and for all sorts of organizations, charities included, that could mean, very pragmatically, a huge reduction in transaction costs. But even more interestingly is what it means for the idea of an organization itself, and this is what Mark was touching on with the idea of DAOs. It has huge implications for corporate governance, because organizations themselves that are currently rely on a certain degree of centralization and structure to run could become distributed and decentralized, and this can open up huge opportunities for charities, I think, in terms of engaging their supporters, and we'll come on to that more in a minute. So the third key feature of blockchain systems, which builds on the first two, is the idea of trust. So you've got a reduction of reliance on third-party authorities that people don't really trust anymore, and you've got this idea that the whole system is radically transparent, so everyone can see what's going on. And that, to me, seems to add up to a revolution in trust. A lot of people talk about it as a huge increase in trust, but a question in my mind is actually, is it more about totally doing away with the idea of trust altogether? You don't need to trust anyone if you can see everything that they're doing and know that they have to abide by what they say they're going to do, because their actions are governed by smart contracts, which is something I'll come on to in a moment, but by protocols that mean that you can't go back on your word. The fourth key feature of these things is because the nature of the blockchain means that it's a ledger on which you can, for the first time, I think, record all of these different types of assets and transactions. There are huge opportunities for much greater automation. So the idea of smart contracts is something that lots of people in the blockchain world are very excited about. And these are self-executing computer protocols. Basically what it means is they kind of, if certain conditions are met, then automatically something else happens. A bit like a legal contract currently, but it is sort of hardwired into the system rather than relying on somebody else to enforce those contractual conditions. And also it has much broader applications than traditional legal contracts do. And then the last key feature, I think, which sort of builds on that idea of recording assets, is that the blockchain could lead to a pretty radical integration of the digital and physical world. So Bitcoin is well known as the use case at the moment for the blockchain, but actually it's a very narrow use case. I mean, using it just to record financial transactions in one cryptocurrency doesn't do justice to what this technology can do. Any asset can be recorded on a blockchain, whether it's physical, digital, or totally intangible. So, for instance, in the music industry, there's a lot of interest at the moment in whether blockchain technology can allow you to record intellectual property and copyright in a way that makes it possible to automate payments for royalties in a world where people are increasingly using streaming services rather than buying physical albums. And also the step beyond that, which I'll come on to as well, is the idea of the Internet of Things, which people might be aware of, which is physical objects, but ones which are smart objects. So they are internet enabled, they're able to interact with their environment and communicate with one another. That's currently happening. There are smart fridges, there are smart cars, there are even smart houses, but currently they're all hidden in little silos and it's slightly disparate, and a lot of people are excited by, or terrified also, by the idea that the blockchain could be the technology that allows a sort of full-blown Internet of Things for the first time. Okay, so building on those, what do I think, given those key features, are the opportunities for charities and philanthropy? So the first one is coming back to this idea of disintermediation. A world without middlemen for the first time. What does that mean for charities? Well, I've touched on already, one of the most pragmatic things is a reduction in costs. Like all organizations, charities face an enormous number of costs just through the need to rely on intermediaries. So, that's card handling for donations, for international charities, FX costs, lawyers, etc. And the less middlemen you have, the lower the transaction costs, hopefully. We've also touched on this. Since the institutions that we rely on currently to maintain those ledgers are not as trusted as they once were, the less that charities have to rely on them, the better that should be for their own levels of trust. And the third one is this idea of new governance models. So if you are disintermediating, well, to some extent, charities themselves are a form of intermediary between donors and end beneficiaries. And the idea of radical disintermediation through blockchain technology may present a challenge as well as an opportunity for charities, because increasingly people might say, why am I relying on this expert organization to do the work on my behalf? I want to go straight to the end beneficiary, and I want to find models that enable me to do that. And we're already seeing this not linked to the blockchain, but through things like Give Directly, which enable people to make payments directly to families in the developing world. And this technology will just make that kind of thing far easier. So the second big opportunity for charities is coming back to what I was saying before about the assets on the blockchain being unique, and you can't swap one for the other without somebody noticing. What this means for charities, say, in terms of donations, is absolute 100% transparency. So donations made in cryptocurrency or on the blockchain in some way, a donor would be able to trace that donation all the way through a charity to what it was spent on, to the end beneficiary, and potentially beyond that. And we're already seeing initiatives actually trying to do this. So the BitGive Foundation in the US has a blockchain donation transparency platform. And in China, Jack Ma, the Alibaba founder, is launching a similar platform to try and shed some light on Chinese charities. Now, that's an opportunity for charities because they could bolster levels of trust amongst the people who support them. But I also think it presents quite a big challenge, because if you're in a situation where somebody is suddenly going to switch the light on and everybody can see everything you're doing, you've got to be pretty confident that you can explain all of that to your supporters. And I think a lot of the recent controversy about people questioning things like fundraising activities, fundraising costs, staff salaries and charities shows that we need to have those conversations now before the technology overtakes us and people can just make their minds up for themselves. So another, I think, quite pragmatic thing that the blockchain technology can offer, and this is currently where there's quite a lot of interest and work going on, is because it's decentralized, it's also non-geographic. It's not tied to any one country or jurisdiction. That makes it far easier and cheaper to move money or assets around. You don't have FX barriers and costs. A couple of articles here talking about this idea. And beyond that, for international organizations operating, say, in parts of the world where there is no infrastructure for moving assets around, there's huge amounts of corruption, and you want to bypass those traditional mechanisms, blockchain and cryptocurrency could provide a really valuable way of getting money to where it's needed urgently. Swoop again. So this is something that I've touched on already, but I just want to dig into slightly more. So you're not limited on the blockchain in terms of the types of assets that you can record on it. As I've mentioned, even things like intellectual property could potentially be put on there. From the point of view of charities, this means that the range of assets people have to give to charity in one way or another is going to be far wider, so we need to have a think about how that might work. Also, because of the ability to automate, it'll be far easier to automate micropayments, say in something like the music industry, but in the world of charity, whereas we currently have micro donations through things like, paying at the till and rounding to the pound, you could have micropayments for, again, you could have it for IP, you could have it for all sorts of different things on the blockchain, but you could also have nano or even pico donations, or, we can go down to femto if you really want, but it would actually be practical for the first time to kind of harvest those tiny, tiny bits of money associated with transactions for the charitable purposes. And then I touched on this idea before. So the Internet of Things, as I said, it's this network of objects that contain embedded technology. They can communicate with each other and their environment and feed that back and change the way they operate. And many people believe the blockchain could provide the infrastructure that really enables this idea to take off. What's that going to mean for charities? Well, firstly, I think there's going to be a fundamental conceptual shift around the idea of ownership. If you have all of these smart objects and you have an infrastructure that allows you to attribute ownership at any one time, for a lot of objects, why would you bother owning them? The only reason most people own a car at the moment is that's the only way you can ensure you've got a car when you want it. And, even now, the technology behind car sharing and things doesn't allow it to be perfect. But in this world, with a kind of blockchain-enabled Internet of Things, it would be pretty seamless. And I think that would hold for a lot of objects. And so in the charitable context, what that might mean is a shift from the idea of donation of assets themselves to donation of spare capacity in shared assets. And that's quite a difference in terms of the way we think about things, and I think I'm not sure quite how charities would adapt to that. And then possibly the craziest idea that I'm going to touch on today is the idea that smart objects are able to interact with their environment, but also to manage their own capacity. So one of the things that people often talk about when they're talking about smart objects is the idea of a fridge that is able to stock itself. So it's able to recognize when you've run out of something and it'll order it for you. Or similarly, you can have a washing machine that is able to sell off some of its spare processing capacity when it's not working, and it can use the money that it generates for that to fund its own repair. Now, what I wonder is, in a system where this has become ubiquitous, there's going to be a lot of spare capacity, and objects are going to be able to sell their own capacity, and there will be surplus in terms of revenue. Some of it can be used to fund maintenance and repairs, but there's going to be more than that, and could that be given away? Now, that might be governed by humans, but in the future, and people are actually already trying to think this through, and I've talked to some of them, could it be that you allow the artificial intelligence governing those smart objects to make decisions for itself? That's crazy, I hear you say. What would it look like? Well, here is a mock-up of how it might work in the case of a smart washing machine. Bear with me here for a minute. So what you would have is the AI in an object manages its own capacity, sells spare revenue, it's got some money for the first time. You might decide as the owner initially that you want to do good with that money, so you stipulate that some of the excess goes to charity. Like, at first, that's inevitably going to happen in much the same way that that sort of system currently works, which is I, as the user, say, these are the charities I support, and the excess money goes to that, similar to round to the pound or ATM giving. But over time, as more data becomes available, the systems that govern these things become more complex, I think it's possible that users could just specify broad cause areas. So I just say, I don't know which charities I want to support, but I want to support environment, cancer charities, and international development in sub-Saharan Africa. And I leave it up to the AI or a series of smart contracts to determine for me which charities are the best ones to give to based on data about impact. And even more exciting, terrifying, one step beyond that, it may get to the point where I, as a donor, think, do you know what? I don't think I'm even best placed to decide what the most pressing needs in society are. I will leave it up to my friendly smart washing machine to analyze data on need at this current moment and impact in terms of organizations, match those two things up and decide how to give the money I have most effectively to serve the most pressing needs. And then what you have here is a new hyper-rational donor class, as I see it, and that's a pretty fundamental shift in terms of how we think about giving to charity. And that's what it looks like. And then the final thing in terms of opportunities, and this is touching on what Mark was saying, is charities and not-for-profits themselves, in the same way as lots of other assets, can be entered or recorded on the blockchain. So, a charity as a legal entity is just a group of people and some documents that tell you how they're going to work together and what that organization will do. All of that can be recorded on the blockchain. You can bind it together with smart contracts. Boom, you've got a blockchain charity. So probably the more important question, as I've said there, is, okay, why do that? Just because you can? Well, two things. One is I think it could fundamentally transform the governance of charities themselves, and it could also transform the way in which charities are regulated by governments and other bodies. So just prepare for a bit of a swoop here. This is quite a big one. Ooh, there we go. Thanks, yeah. So this is where the idea of distributed autonomous organizations come in. So on the blockchain, yeah, you can register these organizations on there, but there's absolutely no reason at all that should reflect traditional models of governance. The organizations themselves can be distributed in all kinds of radical ways. And particularly for organizations that are looking to directly engage their supporters, say in campaigning, having that kind of hyper-democratic structure where everything is decided by, membership vote or something along those lines could offer amazing new opportunities to engage people. This is going to be a big swoop. Ooh, back out again, right. And in terms of the regulation of charities, there are all kinds of practical things that I've talked about that I think are, interesting enough, but not fundamentally radical. The one that I think is radical is this one. So this is the idea that if you had charities registered as entities on the blockchain, you could use smart contracts not only to bind them together, but to codify the ways in which they're allowed to operate. And what I mean by that is, currently, if you want to regulate something, you set some rules, a government or a public body does, and you monitor whether people are obeying those rules, and then you go and slap them on the wrist when they don't obey the rules, and everybody, one assumes, learns a lesson and moves on. But if instead of doing that, you're able to hardwire the rules into the system at the outset, so it's not possible to break them in the first place, that is a fundamental shift in terms of the way that things are regulated, and I think offers some quite significant and slightly terrifying, I think, challenges. Swoop back out. There we go, challenges, seamless. So I just want to pick up on some of the things I've already said and throw in a few others, because I think this technology is very exciting, but I think it does present some significant potential challenges for charities. The most obvious is the early adoption challenge that comes with any technology. So with apologies to people in the room here, in general, I think maybe we could agree that charities aren't renowned for their tech savvy, and the barriers to entry for this stuff are quite high currently. There's a question about risk tolerance. Trustees particularly don't tend to have huge appetite for risk, and these are perceived as untested technologies. They're linked in people's mind to things like Bitcoin. They read stories. They're mostly about people using them to hire hitmen or to buy pornography and these kinds of things. So they're just seen as no-nos. And then another challenge, I think, here is to try and harness the enthusiasm that I certainly see in the tech world and in bits of the charity world at the moment to try and find use cases where this technology can actually be put into practice. Because at the moment, there's an enormous amount of talking about it and how transformative it could be, and I'm doing it right now. But finding people who can actually come up with projects that use blockchain technology in a meaningful way is a challenge. I think there is, obviously Walter White there. I think there's a big challenge in terms of anonymity. So already for charities accepting donations, they have to be very careful about knowing where that money's come from and who the donor is. In a way, these systems are far more transparent because you can see the whole system, you can download it. But it's not true that they're entirely anonymous, but I think it is true that they are eponymous in the sense of you can tell who a user is or which wallet they made a payment from in the case of cryptocurrency, but you don't necessarily know who that person is. I mean, that's a large part of the appeal of Bitcoin for people operating, say, on the darknet, is that you're able to make those transactions without having to disclose that information. And this is a real challenge, I think, for charities if this technology takes off. I think another thing linked to a couple of the things I've already said is that there's going to be a huge pressure on the idea of measuring impact and communicating it effectively. It's already something that everybody in the charity sector, I think, is aware of, but if blockchain technology is used to make the system radically more transparent so everybody can see what charities are doing and what they're spending their money on, and particularly if you start getting robot donors who are solely focused on data and using that in order to determine where to make donations, the idea of measuring impact effectively and communicating it is going to be hugely, hugely important. And I think the challenge there is that unless you're very careful, measurement inevitably just skews activity towards the thing that is measurable. So it's a version of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. That's true in general for impact measurement, but I think in this blockchain scenario, it's going to be even more pressing. This is just a thing I want to throw in, which is related to something that's quite a live debate in the blockchain world at the moment. A lot of what I've talked about seems a kind of utopian vision of distribution, getting power away from trusted authorities and third parties, opening it up, digital liberation. But actually, there is a bit of an ideological battle in the blockchain world at the moment between people for whom that is the vision, public blockchain, open to all, and people who are saying, I like the idea of this stuff in general, but can we make it private? Can we own it? Can we commoditize it in some way? And a lot of the money that is going into this, certainly from the financial services sector, is starting to be in private blockchains. Now, if that is the case, and that's the idea that wins out, are we essentially just swapping one kind of trusted authority for another, albeit one that's actually got significantly more power than any one trusted authority currently? Or actually, is it going to be the case that we can't just have a free-for-all? There's got to be some differentiation between general users and people who have the authority to verify identity and that kind of thing. Another thing that is linked to a seemingly technical question, I think, in blockchain, but I think actually is pretty fundamental, is so the idea of smart contracts that we've touched on, they are protocols that can be on the blockchain and kind of govern the way that things operate automatically. I think they're going to be a vital component of any blockchain future. And I think there's two key questions then. Okay, who gets to decide the content of those smart contracts? And can they be challenged if you decide that they're not right? And particularly if we're talking about charities themselves as entities on the blockchain governed by these smart contracts, that second question is absolutely fundamental. if the way you operate is governed by a smart contract and you have no recourse to challenge it, you're entirely bound by it, and it's a kind of terrifying Kafkaesque nightmare. And just for anybody who's particularly interested in this stuff, actually, there's been a big controversy recently in the blockchain world that is sort of quite closely related to this question. And then finally, touching on something that we talked about right at the beginning of the day, actually, and I was really pleased that came up because it's verified something I was going to say. But I think, as with all other technologies, the story of blockchain tech and technology might not just be about finding amazing new ways of doing social good. I think we have to also be aware that it might create new problems. So as we were saying at the start of the day in the talk about digital exclusion, well, that's something that nobody would have thought of as a problem 20 years ago, but the ubiquity of the internet now means that is a real challenge. And there are other things like online bullying, which are kind of developments of longer standing problems. Now, I don't know what the challenges the blockchain is going to bring are, but my question is it going to create new problems that we can't even foresee yet? And so, in summary, having cantered through all of that stuff, my conclusion, which probably seems a bit woolly, is I think this technology has huge opportunity, but I do also give a cautionary note that I think it presents quite significant challenges. And I really think it's something that charities need to engage in now, because I think there's a danger that the technology is going to happen and it's going to overtake them, and they're not going to have the opportunity to shape it before those challenges become insurmountable. So I think they need to own the technology before it owns them. And I think that's the end. Thank you. Ooh,